Events of fall 2001 forced the public health system to acknowledge a serious lack of preparedness for acts of terrorism and bioterrorism, as well as lack of preparedness for handling the consequences. Let's look back. Information and communication systems were sorely lacking before and after the attacks. The police and fire departments each had their own radio systems, which didn't communicate with one another. The workforce wasn't sufficiently trained. Instead of cooperating, police and firemen worked in competition, issuing confusing evacuation orders. Laboratories weren't ready. In 2001, public health was unprepared to protect the American people, not only from the attacks themselves, but from immediate and long-range health and safety threats that followed. After the buildings collapsed, attention was focused, and rightly so, on rescuing the living and retrieving the dead. But the dust, soot, smoke, asbestos, lead, and PCBs that were released into the air were largely ignored. Although first responders should have been wearing respirators or masks to protect their lungs, most didn't. Years later, many of them developed lung disease and some have died. Others are still being diagnosed. In addition, government was anxious to get itself and business back on track. Though politicians reassured workers and residents that the environment was safe, there was no scientific evidence to prove it. In fact, air pollutants didn't just settle to the ground and get vacuumed away. World Trade Center fires smoldered for months, and toxins remained airborne for considerably longer. In addition to first responders, residents and workers have succumbed to respiratory disorders, and 14 years later, we're still paying for our mistakes. It's important to mention that along with lingering respiratory illnesses, many survivors and workers have suffered unanticipated symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and have needed and will continue to need mental health counseling. For all of this, preparation plans and resources were lacking. The IOM published a second report in 2003, The Future of the Public's Health in the 21st Century, which included lessons learned from the 2001 attacks. One important lesson is that in the 21st century, public health will constantly have to adapt and change to meet new threats. In addition to lack of preparedness for man-made and natural disasters, which include hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes, the 2003 IOM report made some other critical observations. It noted that the public health system was still in disarray years after the 1988 warning. The health of the population as a whole was suffering because of the nation's emphasis on expensive medical treatment rather than preventive services. Serious health disparities among various population groups, according to race and ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomic status, were widening and threatening the public's health. Finally, advances in information technology needed to be used more effectively for the purposes of surveillance and communication. To do its broad and far-reaching job, public health needs adequate funding. Yet in congressional budget cuts, public health has regularly gotten the axe. In a third report for the public's health, Investing in a Healthier Future, issued in 2009, IOM suggested that Congress authorize a stable, long-term financing structure for public health that wouldn't be subject to the ups and downs of the economy. It emphasized that prevention strategies are much cheaper than medical treatments that could have been avoided, and that guaranteed funding for public health would bring a good return on investment, known as ROI in business circles.